had a visit by a man, a carer, and a person suffering from schizophrenia to Christchurch. The man who came in was acting most peculiar. I'm not sure whether Janet can remember, but I can't remember all the details about it. But the man who was ill never said a word. For some reason or another, and again I cannot recall the exact reason, I had to pay a visit sometime later to the mental institute where this gentleman was a patient. I drove up to the gates, I was allowed in, and I'm glad they allowed me out again as well, but I was allowed in, and to my surprise there was this gentleman near the road, and I waved to him, not expecting him to recognise me, and he waved back and indicated to me to stop. Now don't forget, he doesn't talk. I stopped the car, round down the window, and I was about to say to him, "How are you?" not expecting a reply, and he said, "Hello, Pastor." Don't forget, he never speaks. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I really was. I couldn't speak myself for a second or two. And I said to him, I said, "I didn't think you spoke. You could speak." He said, "Oh, I never speak in there." He said, "I have nobody." He said, "One of the things, however, I would love to do is to be like you," pointing to me. "Living a normal life, driving a car like you have. But I have no family." And he went on to tell me his story. When he was a youngster, he was misbehaved, he stopped speaking, he acted violently, so his parents put him away in this mental institute. He'd been there 40 odd years. He was as sane as anyone else here in this room. He was acting. And as Malcolm was relating the various incidents, that particular thing came back. And I'd take that man to the grave with me. I'll never forget his face. "Pastor," he said. And he looked at me, but he doesn't speak. He's ill. He doesn't mention these things. Another man, Jenny would remember him. We had a ministry amongst the down and outs, the drug addicts, those who had no homes, again in the same church. And we had one man in his 60s. He asked to see me one day, so I went down to the crypt and we had an hour or two. And he said, "Pastor," he said, "when I was 14, my father gave me my first drink of beer. He said, I've been drinking beer ever since. He said, I've lost my wife, I've lost my family. But," he says, "every year I go and I steal a bottle of spirits or a bottle of his favourite tipple from the local off-licence in order that he could be put away." Exactly as Malcolm was saying. And these are things that I know from personal experience of working amongst these people. The books are still for sale, and the videos, etc. up there at £5 each. If you haven't had them, please do so. Again, just to mention the chart that is now available. At 4 o'clock or thereabouts, Malcolm is going to open up for questions and discussion. And Peter just put his finger up. I don't think there's any tea afterwards, no. But there will be time for questions and discussion with Malcolm afterwards. And then, having done that, we'll close with a word of prayer around about 4:30. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Peter. The basic subject I want to begin this afternoon with is the question of depression, because that is very, very prevalent today. In today's society, with increasing stress upon our work and our journeys and all that traffic and husband and wife being out, the whole question of stress and anxiety and leading probably to depression is becoming increasingly frequent in today's society. I want to tackle that, and then we'll look briefly at what the true Christian life should be like. So what are the symptoms of depression? The symptoms often include lack of energy, pessimistic thoughts, lack of sociability, slower speech and thinking. It can cause sleeplessness, giving rise to hallucinations, and in manic depressions there is an enormous amount of energy and activity, but then when they get to the end of their strength, they suddenly collapse right the way back into depression. So you can be manic in your activity and manic depressive, showing everybody how energetic you can be, and then when you run out of steam, you're straight back into depression again. Serious depression can result in admission to a psychiatric ward, and there you would be treated with drugs, etc., and so many other things. And electroconvulsive treatment may be administered also. The problem is with the drugs that they can have serious side effects, as you well know. All antidepressant drugs are about as effective as each other. If you take a drug, it affects and improves or helps some 50 to 60% of people, which sounds a reasonable percentage. But then, so are 30 to 40% of people helped who just took a sugared pill, a placebo. So they are only effective for 20 to 30% of those that take them. And therefore, they are with enormous side effects. One wonders why people take them, just to help them out of the present time and bad feelings and bad mood. So the question then becomes, how should depression be treated from a Christian and a biblical point of view? What does the Bible say about depression? Little or nothing, actually. It provides no comfort for those who become truly depressed, from whatever cause. Just take the trials and tribulations of Paul, which he relates in 2 Corinthians 11, 22 to 30, of all the beatings and the shipwrecks he had. He went through an awful lot in order to spread the gospel amongst the Gentiles. And yet, when you read his letters and any of his accounts, there is not a glimmer of depression in any of his letters. In fact, in Philippians 4:4, he says it's so important to rejoice. And it is so important that he says again, rejoice, I say again. Rejoice the fact that you are a Christian, irrespective of what happens to you, because your future is certain. 2 verses later, he gives the instruction, be anxious for nothing. Only a few verses on, he gives a clear directive for the sound Christian life. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are noble, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, think on these things. You see, the Christian is instructed to have a very positive and outgoing attitude to the whole of life. You don't keep looking inwards, you look outwards for the benefit of others and forget yourself. A very positive mindset. And whatever befalls you, we must handle it always in a mature Christian way. Therefore, may I put it to you, that if a Christian falls into despair and into despondency and depression, for whatever cause, he is actually disobeying the Bible's clear requirements. There is no reason that a Christian should ever actually fall into depression. He is not fixing his eyes upon God and upon Jesus and the glorious hope of the future that is a continual thread that runs right the way throughout the Bible. Don't keep looking down, look up, because that is where your final destiny will be. One of my favourite little thoughts is that we have 70 years and 10 in this life, but eternity lasts forever. So I put it to you, which is the more important? There is very little about depression, even in the Old Testament. But we can read even in the New Testament, Philippians 4, verses 4 to 13. Read that and check if the depressed are really obeying God's word to mankind. It gives us all the positive things that we should be doing. There is also very little about depression in the Old Testament. Asaph was despondent when he saw the lives of the rich, and he saw how they prospered, and they died happy and fulfilled men. And yet they were greedy and they were aggressive, and yet they seemed to have prospered. And he was puzzled by this until he went into the house of the Lord. And then what their final fate would be became absolutely clear to him. And he saw it all from God's long-term plan, and his heart was lifted, as we can read in Psalm 73. David was persecuted by King Saul, and he also fell low at times. But in one such time he says, "Oh, why are you cast down, O my soul?" And notice that it's a question. Why are you cast down? As though the heart had no right to be cast down. And it's immediately followed because he says, hope in God. In other words, lift up your eyes, see it from God's point of view. This is all good training so that you may have that true faith that God is looking for. Don't become despondent. Thus, his reaction to depression was exactly the same as Asaph's, to look up and not to draw away, and to draw away from his own tiny little world where everything seems to have collapsed upon him. No, stand back and see the whole thing from God's point of view. But what about great Christians who get depressed? Now, we must be careful here. First of all, that because a well-known, recognised, godly Christian becomes depressed does not make that any more righteous that we should follow in their tracks. It doesn't make depression any more acceptable in God's eyes. We all have faults and failings, and that some people, some great Christians, may have periods of depression does not mean to say that will excuse depression within us. So that's the first point I want to make. But let's look at some of the situations, and very briefly here. The two that are often held up are Spurgeon and Cowper. And also I'll give you some of the views of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Now, I was told, and I read that, of course, it was great people like Spurgeon and Cowper were depressed. And I said, well, I don't really know the background, certainly of Cowper, not at that stage. So I got out the 2 volumes, it's almost like an autobiography of Spurgeon, went through it quite carefully, and I came to the very clear conclusion. He was never, ever depressed. That man was far too active. He never was depressed. What he suffered from was very, very painful periods of his illness, which I think was a severe form of gout. His pain was so intense that it absolutely took all the life and go out of him. And that is the period when he was low, and on one occasion he did use the word depression. But my examination of his case, I'm quite certain his was not the normal type of depression that people usually talk about when they say they are depressed. Far, far from it. Because he said in one of his sermons, I want you to notice, dear friends, that this rejoicing is commanded. It is not a matter that is left to your option. You are commanded to rejoice, brethren, because this is for your profit. Now, a depressed person would never ever write those sort of lines, I'm quite sure. Since that question was raised with me, I have actually read the life story of William Cowper. You will find it in Genius, Grief and Grace by the Christian psychiatrist Gaius Davies. I'm afraid that we have differed in the past, but he does give an outline of Cowper's life. I'm not going to go into it, but have a look at that if you ever get a copy of that book, Genius, Grief and Grace, and read through the life of Cowper and see if you can see why he was depressed, not just occasionally. Even when he was a Christian, he had some 6 or 7 quite bad bouts of depression. Read his life story, and I'm going to leave it to you just to see why that man became truly depressed. And I'm afraid that Dr. Davis seems to be ambivalent, because as a psychiatrist he's looking for a medical problem. And there he always starts off by his articles and letters by saying, of course, depression is an illness. But even when he's talking about Cowper, he has to then start to admit that environment and his way and his behaviour does start to affect him. Because he says in one point, slowly and inexorably, his real failures caught up with Cowper, leading to a depression. The influence of the things we have already considered is evident. In other words, he is acknowledging that something in Cowper's past life, and even in his present life, is the thing that really made him depressed. And then Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, when I was working on the book with Robert Law, talking about depression, I got hold of, or had already got, Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones' book on spiritual depression. Now, I'd read it quite a long time before, and as I picked it up, I thought, well, I'm pretty certain what he's going to say, because he's a medical man. He looks at things from a medical point of view. He's going to say, well, you've got to be careful with depression, you've got to sort of treat it carefully, you've got to give them the right sort of drugs, and perhaps they can get over it, etc. When I actually read what he said, it was completely opposite of what I expected, and it was in full agreement with what we are trying to say about true biblical counselling. And I'll give you some of the quotations. Much to my surprise, as I say, he was quite contrary to what most medical people say. And I quote, I say that this person is still morbidly and sinfully preoccupied with self. I said just now that we have to be brutal with this condition. And it has to be said that the real trouble with these people is still self. They appear very humble and full of contrition, but it is mock modesty. It is a self-concern. Forget yourself, leave the judgment to him. Get on with the work. In a sense, the depressed Christian is a contradiction in terms, and he is a very poor recommendation for the gospel. And saying, I'm in great difficulty, it probably means that we are all the time centred upon ourselves. That is introspection. And in turn it leads to the condition known as morbidity. One very damning phrase that he used is as follows. Psychology, I believe, is one of the most subtle dangers in connection with the Christian belief. We do not preach psychology, we preach the Christian faith. And they are the words of an expert doctor. He was intended to be right on the edge of being the top doctor in the land. He gave it all up to preach the gospel. And this is his opinion of what the situation with depressed people. Throughout the book he says exactly the same that we are proposing with true biblical counselling. That it is self-centredness and a self-pitying attitude to life that is the cause of depression. What is the real cause of depression? We must find the real cause, not the theoretical cause as put around by the professional medical and psychiatric people. One of the things that, however, that people don't realise, and I didn't realise this myself until I was speaking to Robert, and he pointed out that there is one aspect of depression that is not at all evident unless you start to look for it and you realise that it's there. And that is, there is always in depression an element of anger and rage. It was only when Robert pointed it out to me that I started to read these things, and certainly reading psychiatric reports, and sure enough, there it was. The psychiatrists know it, the psychologists know it, but they never refer to it. They know that anger is a big factor in depression. And why don't they ever mention it? Because anger is an emotion, and a person should be in control of his emotions. So if he's angry about something, that means he is responsible for it. And that is not what the doctors and the psychiatrists and the psychologists are looking for. They're looking for some chemical problem or imbalance in the brain, or some problem perhaps from outside that the person can't handle, but they never talk about guilt or responsibility. And they never talk about anger. And yet it is always there. It is one of the most common elements. This is because it's an emotion and not an illness. If it's an illness, it makes it into a medical problem, and they can deal with it if it truly is a medical problem. If it's a lack of serotonin or dopamine or whatever they care to blame, then perhaps they can make up for it, give that person a drug, and they are, quote, cured. But it never works as simple as that. As I said before, words such as guilt, responsibility and maturity are absolute anathema to psychiatrists, because it puts the blame back on the depressed person, or whoever they are treating, even if they're not depressed. Hence their reliance on drugs to deal with all the problems that come before them. The anger is in two directions. It's aimed, first of all, to other people. They want other people to praise them, to tell them what a wonderful person they were. And if they don't get that positive feedback continually to a depth that satisfies them, they collapse. Nobody loves me. Nobody takes notice of me. Nobody cares about me. I'm on my own. And therefore they go into that terrible spiral of depression. And the deeper you go, the more difficult it is to come out of it. That, first of all, there is the anger against others. They're looking for a positive feedback. They're always wanting something to tell them how wonderful they are. And they never get it in a measure that is fully and ultimately satisfying. They're also, the anger is very much directed against themselves, because they are conscious themselves that they are not making a go of life. They have failed in life's test. They haven't stood up to the problems of life. They have run away from them, and they despise themselves, and they are angry against themselves. The self-anger, it is extremely destructive, and it is there in all depressed people. Let me give you one, what I think is a classic example. Robert Law, as I say, was medically qualified, and he was a GP. And one day he stood in as a locum for another GP. And in came a missionary. And he said, "Oh, I've just come for a repeat prescription for my antidepressant." So Robert said, "I will not give you your antidepressant until you tell me what you're angry about." And this man was infuriated. He said, "I'm not angry about anything." So Robert said, "All right, go away, and I will only prescribe your prescription, give you your drugs, when you tell me what you're angry about." And the man sat there for a while, thinking it through. And then the story came out. He'd been a missionary in South Africa, very, very happy in his work there, whatever it was he was doing. He was very happy out there. His wife fell ill or didn't like the environment or whatever it was, and she came back, had to come back to this country. So he was forced to leave that work, which he so thoroughly enjoyed, and come back and live in this country. And that really annoyed him. And he took his presence away from him, travelled all over the place so that he wasn't with his wife. So he was angry with her, and he was angry with himself and being such a failure and being so angry with the way in which he was behaving. He knew he wasn't behaving properly, and he was angry with himself. Now the point that I want to make there, the important point there, is that Robert had never ever seen this man in his life before. And as soon as he sat down and said, "I would like my tablets for depression," Robert immediately said, "What are you angry about?" And when you ask that question, you're likely to get a bit of an explosion, but then you might surely get through to the real truth. Basically, again, I can't get my own way. And how are you going to deal with that problem when you can't? Let me just mention that two things which are not depression. First of all, exhaustion is not depression. You can work very hard, feel absolutely shattered, but given a day or two or three or whatever, when you've recuperated, you'll be back to yourself. That is not depression. And a lot of people talk about feeling low. We all feel that we're not quite up to scratch and feel a bit tired, whatever it may be. That is not depression. Depression is feeling bad about yourself and not being able to communicate very well with other people at all. Neither is loneliness. People can get very low and lonely because they have no friends, because they're on their own, they've lost their husband or their wife or whatever it might be. Loneliness is not really depression, but it can lead on to depression. And that is where, if somebody feels that they are very lonely, they should stop being in themselves, try as far as they possibly can to get out, join groups and clubs in a church, so you can join in all the activities of life that is surrounding you, not to go into that spiral of self-centred depression. But what about the progress of depression? I give several cases of depression in our book, Breakdowns Are Good For You, and since then I have started up a little email form which I call the ATBC. It's just simply an exchange of information between those who are interested in counselling. It's free, anybody can join it, it's on email. Go to my website, Bowden, and it's all the details are there if you'd just like to join us. You don't have to be a counsellor or experienced in counselling. All I ask is, first of all, that you agree with the principles of true biblical counselling, as I've broadly outlined here. And that secondly, you have an interest in counselling. That's all I ask. And if you send in clips and comments, and I make comments, and I send out an email of anything from 3 to 5 or 6 pages every 6 to 8 weeks or thereabouts, and we're up to issue number 35 at the moment. And when I look back over some of those issues of ATBC, some of the materials are very, very interesting because it's a further development from our book, Breakdowns Are Good For You, which was, I think came out in 99, so it's about 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old now. So all this has taken place, and everything there I find confirms again and again what we have said in that book. There's not a single thing in that book that I would ever want to retract as being incorrect. Not a thing. And quite frankly, that applies to all of my books. I've researched them very carefully, and I have no reason whatsoever to take back anything that I have ever said in all of my 4 creation books or my one book on counselling, our one book on counselling. Because I realise that when you write something and it's going to be published, that book takes on a life of its own, and you have no control of where it's going to finish up. So you have to be almighty careful that what you are reporting is the truth, and it's not going to be easily demolished. I'm very, very careful when I'm writing on any subject like that. But one of the things that did surprise me is the consistent pattern that appears in depression. And the pattern that came out, as I say, in looking at things after we'd written the book. And I've read many, many accounts, and there's such a repeated pattern which I never fully expected. Not much takes me surprised by in these days, but I was surprised at the regularity of the pattern that appears in depression. And you read any reasonable length of account, somebody's gone through depression, come out the other side, and you will find it has a sequence somewhat like this. First of all, the person records the progress of his illness. It always starts off that it's an illness, in some detail, and it starts from childhood to recovery. The person records his illness, and they are told by their doctor or their psychiatrist, that they are ill with depression. That is a great relief to them, because this is attributed to a chemical imbalance, usually something like serotonin. They express great gratitude and relief for this discovery, because now they are ill, and all the guilt has been taken away from it. It's not their fault, it's an illness, just like breaking your leg, and therefore they are excused from any guilt feelings at all. You poor chap, you've got a lack of a chemical imbalance. My expectations. This is attributed to a chemical imbalance. They express to the doctor great gratitude and relief for this discovery that they are suffering from an illness, and they can now offload their sense of guilt. They are prescribed drugs that lift their mood. For many, there will, however, be serious side effects, and some of them just abandon them eventually. However, they still realise that even with the drugs, there's something wrong. They start to make positive steps to get back to normal again. Eventually, they are well on their way to becoming normal people with or without the drugs. So they've gone through this depression, they're now coming well out of it, and they're now writing about their past experience. At the end of the article, or in describing their history, they record certain attitudes to life that are far from normal. And this is the key factor that I found in every single case that I looked at in some detail. They were attention-seeking, excessive fear of what others are thinking of them, perfectionism, etc. Some admit that they were mainly to blame for their depression. But now they realise that they are a much stronger person than they were before they were depressed. Much stronger psychologically. Most, in fact, admit that they are glad that they went through the depression and came out the other side, because they are now much more peaceful and learnt much more about what life is really all about, and living it in a more balanced way, a more changed and a more relaxed attitude to life. But looking over the article, I can always mark out the points which I think are most significant, because the most revealing fact of their history is their own account, or I would call it an admission, of their behaviour before they really became depressed. In every single case that I have got enough information about, we find there's a mixture of pride, self-centredness, wanting to be the centre of attention, or excessive fear of what other people's opinions about them might be. They are perfectionists, to be admired for their high standard of achievement. If I do this thing, whatever it is, in absolute perfection, nobody can grumble at me. So the perfectionism, to be admired for all that they achieve and to avoid any criticism, or there's sometimes a desire for power over others, a very powerful emotion in some people. Power over others is important. And much else of this sort of thing is in their background. You can always trace it there. Given enough account, that is what you will find. Let me prove it by giving some of the accounts of the depressed people themselves as they've gone through this and what they've actually said about their own depression. Case 1. Despite performing to attract attention and to impress, I retreated inside myself. I now realise how isolated I was. I wanted to be the Nye Bevan of my generation. And of his depression, he actually said, it was almost, and then he emphasised it, almost worth it. Going through depression to make him the more relaxed and happy person that he is now. Second case. Always snappy, I became vehemently angry and aggressive. Like many depressive people, I tried to do too much. I wanted to be perfect. I thought no one would love me unless I tried to be a superwoman. My illness, see how the overtones are still there, My illness made me stop all that. My expectations aren't as high as they used to be. Third case, a psychologist, and this is a psychologist, this is interesting because this is a psychologist who went through depression. He had a mask of self-confidence to hide his shyness. He was totally self-centred and aggressive to others. And while he was depressed, he wondered if he was faking his symptoms to gain sympathy and attention. Even my breakdown was a fake. That's written by a psychologist. He was a terrible man because his obituary said he was an impossible man to deal with. And my comment is, who said depression was an illness? Fourth example. As I grew older, I became more and more difficult to avoid something I'd spent much of my life trying to escape: reality. The only person I ever have grieved for is me. My depression exists independently from what is going on externally. I found that drinking relieved some of the loneliness and self-hatred. I felt, if only for the moment, I sobered up for 6 months ago when it became clear to me that I could not begin to tackle my problems drunk. Talking to psychiatrists hadn't helped because my mood was being manipulated by the mind-altering substances I was taking. So you can see this same pattern in all people who are depressed. Me, mine, how I'm feeling, what people are reacting to me, how am I being admired for being a great person. If it's not, then I'm going to go even deeper into the spiral. And I have found these in every single case, such that if we found in every case, I have come to the conclusion quite clearly it is pride, self-centredness and self-pity that are at the root of all depression, and in fact of all mental, so-called non-organic mental illnesses. Now when you say something like that, particularly in public, on a public platform, not that I have ever spoken about this before in such a way, but I did get a letter published in a magazine. And in that I used a few words, and I said, depressed people are ill. No, sorry. I said it takes only a few moments of conversation with a depressed person to realise that they are wallowing in a sea of self-pity. And having got that published in a Christian magazine, the whole world erupted around me. I was allowed no further replies. 3 letters were published against the whole idea of depression being non-clinical. And I got 3 direct emails, the results of which were really quite interesting. Perhaps if I have time I might mention it. But I had 3 emails, one of which eventually backed off, and 2 of them eventually bought the book. When I explained to them exactly what I was trying to say, but was not allowed to reply. And most of them said in the articles and letters that were published, depressed people are ill and need to be kindly treated. Obviously you have never been depressed yourself. Lacking in Christian love and sympathy. Yes, some may be due to self-centredness, but surely not every case. I know a good friend, etc. That is the sort of response that I got. How does one begin to answer such charges? Actually, in my early years, I did not have a particularly easy life. I had a very, very big problem facing me, and I had to grit my teeth really hard and go through with it. And that has taught me a big, big lesson. The thing that I feared most was actually the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me stand up on my own 2 feet. I'd lived a very sheltered life before, and going into the forces was my big, big problem. It was a huge barrier that I tried to avoid. I went into the forces, did my national service, and as I say, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me stand on my own feet. And that lesson has been taught to me, and when I come to write the book and looking back, and I realise why God had taken me through this very, very difficult time, very stressful indeed. Why did he take me through that time? And it suddenly dawned on me, because I'd had to learn these lessons much later in life than most people do. And when you learn lessons late in life, they are fixed, and you learn them in a very clear way. So that when I started to write the book and put it all together, those lessons of gritting your teeth and doing what is right, irrespective of how you feel, gives you great benefits in the end. I'd learned that in my previous life, and I then saw why God took me through those particular experiences. and how true and accurate and good he is to us, to give us that training, because he has the future in mind. And that certainly applies in my case. Robert also suffered from depression while he was at training college in studying to become an Anglican minister. But he took hold of the Bible and said, the Bible promises me I will not be depressed, and he decided whatever he felt like, he was going to claim a positive outlook, and that brought him right the way out of it. So we both have gone through difficult times. And the question then becomes, who are you? How can you talk about depression when you've never been depressed yourself? My question is, are you saying that nobody should counsel unless they've gone through a depressing period? Because if so, are you saying that all ministers have got to go through depression in order to counsel people with depression? You know, it's a sort of catch-22 situation, surely, isn't it? That's what I was thinking. And the reaction of anger to such claims have no relevance as to whether they are true or not. Let me give you another brief example from Robert's experience. A woman came to him with postnatal depression. She'd had this young child, and she came to him with a child with postnatal depression. And as she's speaking away, Robert's listening very, very carefully. When she finished, he said, "The reason why I think you're depressed is because this is a late, unexpected child, and all your other children are growing up nicely, and all your friends, all their children are growing up nicely, and they can now look forward to a life of comparative freedom to do what they like. But you've got this child, and it has pinned you down, and that is really why you are depressed." She was infuriated with him that he should suggest such a thing. But a little while later, he met her in the street, and she wound down the window of a car, and he went up to her, and she later admitted, "What you told me was absolutely true, but I hated you for it." He asked her if she still had black depressions. "No, because I now know what I am doing." You see, people like that, they know where the truth really lies. And that is what you have to somehow bring out. Ministers in particular can work hard, they're on their own, quite often much of the day. They have to set their own goals, their own achievements, and if they're not very good at that, they can also fall into some degree of depression, particularly if they don't get good feedback, regular, good, uplifting feedback from their congregation. Ministers and lonely housewives can so easily fall into depression, particularly if they're not getting good feedback. Perhaps they may not deserve it, but if they work hard, don't get the feedback they're looking for, they're on their own, much of the time, they can easily fall into depression. Housewives also, because they're often on their own, perhaps with a small child, perhaps they had a very busy life before, and suddenly the change in circumstances is almost too much for them. So let's try and be a little bit more positive. Again, we can only advise against negative feelings as we are directed in the Bible. Whenever the first steps of self-pity are taken, the warning bell should ring loud and clear. And that is where a loving church fellowship should be able to help you so very much. How should a Christian deal with the problems in life? Well, I've already half outlined this. The root problem is self-centredness. Then the answer is obvious. We must begin to take a real interest in people outside of ourselves. The Bible never says that life will be easy for ourselves or otherwise, whether it be smooth or trouble-free. When we realise this, we must stand up to the problems of life, no matter how big they may be. They are sent to strengthen and test us, as you see in the Bible time and time again. Welcome, it's most difficult to understand if you don't see it from the right point of view. Welcome these difficulties, because this is the way that God is testing your faith. He is here testing what your concept of God is like. If you've got a small God, he's going to collapse at the first blow of the winds of life. If you've got a great and a glorious God that you can look to and realise that he is testing you to see what your faith is like, the attitude is completely different. Any tendency to mope or have a pity party must be resisted. And this question of feelings is very important. We must do things that is right, whether we feel like it or not. And if you've got a particular habit we find it's difficult to break, you've got to break it, and you will find that it doesn't disappear overnight. It can take up to 6 weeks to train yourself into a new habit. Don't expect things to change overnight. If you've got a particular habit that you're finding very difficult to break, it can take 6 weeks in order to retrain the autonomic nervous system. And there is one, I mentioned this is a very practical thing, with anybody that's got any depression, get them to do some hard physical exercise. They have found that to be far better than any of the drugs and prescriptions that they give. Hard physical exercise. And if you do that and then you have a nice warm shower afterwards, your attitude to life will surely be a lot better than that. J. Adams has written over 40 books on this sort of subject, and he has got the same approach as us to that, but he is in America, we are here. Glasser, Maynard and Harrington were also would have had exactly the same approach to depression in any of their people there. Robert Lord realised the depression from his work in psychiatric units, and this is indicative of some of the support that we have from other people. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, well, I've just read you some of his, and Dr. Dorothy Rowe counselled depressives and would not allow them to blame shift. Now, that's a secular psychologist who put a finger on it. She would not allow people to blame anybody else. Professor Gary Almy became a Christian after he had progressed in psychiatry, became a professor of psychiatry. You can read a summary of his talk on my website. And in it, he makes the statement to Christians, do not go in for the profession of psychiatry. And this is a top psychiatrist advising Christians not to take it up as a profession. What we have to do is to change the life of people, and cognitive behaviour therapy is the nearest secular thing. It is the most productive thing of counselling is cognitive behaviour therapy. The only problem is that there's hardly any counsellors who are doing it. So when they've got thousands of people with all these problems, and they say, yes, we recognise that cognitive behaviour therapy is the best, they've got hardly anybody to do any counselling. And why is it the best? Because the official description, this is based on the idea that what we think about ourselves and by the world around us affects how we feel and our behaviour. By changing the way we think, we can change our behaviour and emotional reactions. And this whole point of changing reactions is exactly what we're trying to do in true biblical counselling, except that we are basing it upon the Bible. And that is our directive for the whole of our lives. So what is the essence of a happy Christian life? It is to avoid falling into the pit of depression, if that's just one thing, to be loving and active and outgoing, and to be truly humble in all that we do. We should not take umbrage or become angry when ridiculed, humiliated, mocked at, or anything like that. Sneered at. Why should you worry what people think of you? Do that which is right, and you will be right in the eyes of God. Remember Christ's humiliation on the cross. Take that as your example. He took all that on that cross. And that is how we should react when people criticise us and laugh at us and mock us and ridicule us. Just let it bounce off. It's only affecting something inside you. And that something inside you that it is affecting is your pride. As ever, C.S. Lewis puts this admirably in Mere Christianity. If you go to the end of the chapter called The Great Sin, he says this: do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be the sort of greasy, smarmy person who is always telling you that, of course, he is a nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed to be a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. My question is, how many of us can match up to that standard? Ephesians 4:11-14. Read that carefully. It's where the church is given priests, apostles and teachers and evangelists. And you read it on the next few verses and you'll see it builds up to a climax. And the climax is the whole purpose of the church, the formation of the church, was to give instruction to produce mature Christians. And we need to ask ourselves this fundamental question: how mature a Christian am I? How mature are we really in all that we seek to do? And I ask myself, what is my answer? And may I ask you, what is your answer? Well, I think I've said more than enough to raise the ire and anger of some of you here at any rate. And I'm fully prepared to be dragged out into the courtyard, to be chained to the stake, and have the faggots piled around me, ready for setting light. And Peter has very, very kindly offered to supply the iron, the flint, and the tinder to get it all going nicely for you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Malcolm. I also offered him either petrol or paraffin. He chose paraffin. He says it burns slower. Whilst we're going to open up in a moment just for some questions, but whilst Malcolm was speaking there, two things came to my mind. When we first moved down here to Bexhill in the 1970s, we registered with a Christian doctor, and I had to go and see him on some minor medical thing, and every time I went to see him, he'd say, "How are you, Peter?" I said, "Well, I'm here under false pretenses, really," and we start talking about theological things. He was a great doctor. And one day, and I'll never forget this, he said to me, he said, "We need men such as yourselves, Bible-believing Christians, to have an office here in the surgery." And I wondered what he was speaking about. And he said, because 90% of the problems that we have here in Bexhill, you people, Bible-believing Christians, have the answer to. Then he went on to say, all I can do as a doctor is to give them the pill. And that spoke volumes to me. The other incident that came to mind was Malcolm was speaking about hiding things, the hiding reality of life. Because again, whilst we were down in Exeter, we had this outreach amongst the homeless, as I mentioned earlier. And we had an invitation to go along to one of the squats. So Janet and I went along to one of the squats that these folk had. It was a right mess, believe you me. And when we walked in, I said to one of the young men, they were 18, 19, 20-year-olds, "Why is it that you take drugs? Why is it that you drink?" Because, he says, we don't want to face the realities of life. And that is exactly the same as Malcolm has been speaking about this afternoon. So thank you, Malcolm. I'm now opening up for questions. Do please direct your questions to Malcolm if you have any. But we'll do it in an orderly fashion as should be done in churches. If you have a question, please put your hand up in the air. I'll acknowledge you and then put your question to Malcolm. Don't all come with the big rush. Yes, brother over there, Malcolm.
What are we to make of the experiments on school-age children which seem to show that food additives affect their behaviour, and doing away with the additives and things like that improves their behaviour? Is that something different to what you've been talking about today?
No, that is quite a difficult area. I can't say that I've studied, but I do acknowledge that it does seem to be. I know in the American schools in New York, they decided to do something about the food that the youngsters were having for midday, and they did change it down to much more wholesome food, and it had quite a remarkable effect upon their behaviour. Yes, this is one of the many aspects that can affect a person's behaviour. But even with that, there is this very, very important element of self-control. You may feel like hitting somebody in the face if you're aggressive, if you're that way inclined, but you always have the ability to stop yourself if you want to. And what people are not prepared to do is to give way from their feelings. They want to act out their feelings because that's the way they think they can handle life. They do these things and then they perhaps might regret it afterwards. But ultimately they do have much more control over what they do, even though they're being fed on the wrong food. There is a degree of control. And one of the things that I found most fascinating, you might like to do a Bible study on the Greek word sophronos. It means, and it's translated generally, self-control. And you'll be surprised at the number of times that that crops up in the Bible. Paul talks about it to Timothy, and you will find it time and time again. He talks about self-control. Other words may also be translated by that. But this whole question of self-control is very, very important. You remember I read out the gifts of the fruit of the Spirit: faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So no matter what we may feel like doing, we still have the control not to do it if we're that way inclined, if we really want to, and express true godly Christian behaviour in doing the right thing, though we may not feel like doing it. Okay?
Peter at the back.
I remember not so long ago, I mentioned to somebody that a Christian, a true Christian who's in fellowship with the Lord should not ever suffer depression.
Right.
And immediately they pointed to Job, who suffered bereavement, illness, etc., etc. How would you answer?
I don't think that Job was actually depressed. Look at the many positive. He was trying to find a cause for the state that he was in, whether he was guilty about it or not. It's an unusual book, Job, because everybody says to him, "Oh, if you're suffering, go to the book of Job." But actually, if you go to the book of Job, it doesn't give you a great deal of comfort except what we are saying. Job was beginning to complain against God. You remember? And right towards the end, I think it's in the later parts of Job, God turns around to him and says, "Look, we know from the experience that Satan wanted to tempt him, and God gave him permission. Right? See how faithful my servant Job is." And he was faithful right the way to the very end. But when Job started to ask for answers, he came up against God's, and I call it the brick wall. Go to Romans 9, about the middle of the verse, and you will come up against God's brick wall. I always call it God's brick wall. Because there, people say, it's not right that you've chosen someone, and you know, why are you blaming us if we can't help it? And Paul says, end of story. Who are you to question God? This is God's world, it's His universe, He's running on His lines, He's got his plan, and it's working out perfectly because He's in total control. Who are you to question this great, omnipotent God who knows everything from beginning to end? And Job is silenced. And when we eventually come to that point, we realise that this is God's world, and leave the running of the world to Him. We've got our own problems, and He's interested in how we react to our problems. But some people say, I can't understand it, I can't accept Christianity because I can't understand every aspect of it. That's not the problem. The problem is to deal with life as you can see it. You haven't got all the answers, and if you read in Romans 9.5, as I call it, God's brick wall, God says, I'll answer your questions just so far, but no further. Because it's my world, it's my universe, and it's going to be run on my lines, and I will give you an explanation when it's all over and done with. But meanwhile, you've got to live on in faith. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Yes.
Susan.
There was a very interesting series on television called Brat Camp, where unruly English teenagers were sent to America and made to face their responsibilities, as you said. Was that biblically based? Because it didn't really come across in the series.
I saw some of the extracts of that. It was about 6 months ago or so. Yes. The interesting thing was, although you please be very, very careful what you see on TV and how you interpret it. Every single thing on the television is very, very carefully looked at and censored. And they will only put on for millions of people to watch that aspect of life which they want you to believe. You have got no idea how carefully manipulated, well perhaps you have after some of our elections, you begin to see the manipulation of the media behind it all. But that Brat Camp actually was being run by a group of Christians, because you remember that they had a service in a little one part of their compound in a little church, and all the youngsters were sort of snivelling and sort of mocking at part where you could see it. But they were banging out their somewhat old-fashioned sort of golden bells, type of things. It was fine, great. So therefore it did have a Christian basis. But I never heard once that they were challenged with their responsibility from a Christian point of view. Now, those bits may have been edited out, because they only showed this little bit of the organ playing there, more or less to say, well, of course, this is the sort of hillbilly background behind it all, you see. So what else they missed out, it's often what they miss out that could tell you more, and you have to sometimes read between them. Pardon?
You don't know about that group?
No. but certainly it seemed to have had a Christian basis, because I think it was in the county of Maine, wasn't it? It was in the which is known to be very strictly a Bible Belt, and they said you can't drink too much, all sorts of very restrictive legislation in the county of Maine, and that's where it was centred. So it did have a Christian basis. I couldn't see on what we were allowed to see on the TV any Christian basis in the counselling, but it may have been there. Okay, in the Black Camp. Okay. Yes.
Any more questions? Another question? Again, oh, sorry, somebody over here. Yes, Edward.
You didn't say anything about people who are demon possessed. I have invariably taught that people who nowadays are said to be schizophrenic are in many cases demon possessed. I'm not talking about minor psychotic cases, but people who are really schizophrenic. I have maintained that they are demon possessed. Could you enlarge on that?
That is a fairly controversial area, even within, I won't say true biblical counselling. But J. Adams always somewhat half dismissed demon possession, and he got into a lot of trouble with the good sound evangelicals about dismissing it because it's there in the Bible. I can only say, because I come from a very non-Christian background, I came from a non-Christian background. I was a liberal Methodist for 17 years, and then I was an evangelical since 1974. So you can see my background does not have any within it any demon possession teaching, but I certainly read it there in the Bible. All I can say is that some of the things I've read, I can quote you one person who said, I used to talk about demons, but I don't do it any longer. I can give you the book, name and title if you're interested. But all I can say is, okay, fine, if you consider that schizophrenia is due to demon possession, how is it that Maynard, Harrington and Glasser could cure these people without any reference to the Bible at all, simply by training them to take responsibility? I've had long conversations, email conversations, let me add, with a member of the ATBC, that's the email forum that I was talking about, who does believe in demon possession. So you can see that the arguments backwards and forwards have gone on for... We had a big bout, when I first started the ATBC several years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, we had a big discussion. It's all there in our issues, the ATB issues that I have now at home, and they've been emailed out. And it then went quiet, and now recently woke up again with the same gentleman. He works in Finland, but he often goes out to India, and he said, I've seen these sort of things out there. Now, I think there's a difference between this middle-class, affluent society that we're in, as against going to non-Christian background in somewhere like India, on the missionary situation. There, I think you can meet demon possession, quite possibly in its, I'll call it perhaps a more pure form, real demon possession. I don't personally, it's a very much a personal thing, and I'm quite prepared to be wrong and to be corrected. I don't look upon people with schizophrenia as having any demon possession, I'm afraid. That is my viewpoint. Because it can be cured by these sort of secular means. And I'm just simply taking those secular means a little bit further and saying, let's deal with it from a Christian point of view. And I don't really see demon possession as such in schizophrenics. But I may be wrong. Yes?
This is just something interesting. As a family, we've had dealings with the mental health service over the years, and during one visit from a CPN, which is a community psychiatric nurse, the statement was made about people not knowing what they've done. And this lady said, she said, well, in over 30 years of being a CPN, she couldn't truthfully say that she'd come across anybody who didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, I quite agree.
And that's a non-Christian.
Yes. J. Adams gives a very interesting example of that. He talked about a woman who became extremely depressed, and she just sat in a chair, and she was counseling, people were talking to her, and she didn't say a word. And he said, now that person, irrespective of their failure to respond, is listening to every single thing that is said, taking it in, and knows exactly what's happening. but she's failing to respond. And people say, oh, she's just not listening, she can't hear. She's almost treated her as if she was deaf. And I think, if my memory is right of the case, that I think J. Adam then said, right, now I'm going to talk to you, and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the future if you don't come out of this depression. And he laid out for her all the sequence that she'd go through. She would be visited by a doctor, she would have drugs perhaps injected into her, she would finish up in a mental institution, she would lose her family. He laid the whole thing out for her. And he knew that she was listening to him. Because this idea that they're not listening, they've switched off, isn't true. They know exactly what is being said. It's just they're choosing not to respond. And I think, again, I'm quoting from a long distance memory, I think once that had all been set before her, she started to respond and say a few words and start to come out of the depression, because he'd set out for her exactly the path that she would be going down if she stayed in that so-called vegetative state. And I think eventually she came through it all. But I quite agree with you. Don't think anybody can't hear you. They always can, and they're taking in every single thing that you say. Yes?
We have 3 questions at the back there first. Anne, if you would please. Then
I've read most of the book you wrote on this topic, and there was one thing that I didn't quite agree with.
It's not uncommon.
Sorry?
It's not uncommon.
It's more of a comment than a question, but I'd like your comment on my comment.
Yeah.
Might, for a limited period, be necessary to use chemicals to undo the physical and biochemical damage that's been done.
Yes, but that surely is the key of it. We all have different environments and backgrounds and trainings as a young person. And if we do, my first question is, why does a young person choose to think bad thoughts or depressive thoughts? Again, it may come back to the amount of importance they give to their own self-centredness. So that's just a key question, even in a very early age. That's the first thing. Secondly, because they have had certain experience, and I come back to this retraining of the autonomic nervous system, this is Robert from a medical point of view, and J. Adams said it can take 6 weeks to retrain a bad habit. After 3 weeks you feel you're getting used to it, and it takes another 3 weeks to really feel that it is part of you. So the whole thing comes back to their attitude to life. And the third point I would make is that no matter what their present state is, they will be held responsible before God, whether they're Christians or not, for the attitude they take to other people, whether they've been trained one way or not. They know that deep within inside them there is something like a conscience and a guilty feeling when they behave badly. And when they go against that, they will be held responsible. So when you talk about chemicals, basically the chemicals are of their own making, to a certain extent. Right. Can I lead on from there, from a very important point, because there's so much that I could talk about, but I think there's one important aspect that people don't realise. We all start off with different personalities. Extrovert, introvert, strong-willed, timid, you name it. A whole range of different personalities. But has it ever struck you that the Bible never, ever refers to personality? Not once. It just simply says, that's what you should do, that's the way you should go, and in the words of Christ, be ye perfect, for your heavenly Father is perfect. So, we all start off with like a jagged star, some are good, some are bad. We all start off with a jagged star because we're excessive in one area, or lack of inability in certain other areas, not abilities, but our own personality. We've all got strengths and weaknesses, more than we should have in various areas. None of us is perfect. The perfect person is a perfect circle because he's got everything in good balance, like Christ was. He was strong when he needed to be strong, and he was gentle when he needed to be gentle. And we get the two aspects muddled up, don't we? We're strong when we should be weak, and we're weak when we should be strong. And that is where we start to go wrong. But the Bible never makes any allowance for personalities. And I'll put this forward to as my point of view, is that no matter what personality we start off with, It is up to us to recognise our strengths and our weaknesses, and remember that Satan is quite just as happy if we fall over the edge because of our so-called strengths as we are to fall over the other edge if we are with our weaknesses. He doesn't care which way we go, so long as we get off that balanced and mature Christian attitude to life. And it is a lifelong job for us all